The racist teacher smirked as she humiliated the black girl, certain no one would stop her. But today, she bullied the wrong child. Because when her father walked in, the entire school went silent, and in that moment, she knew her career was over. What happened next will leave you speechless. The school hallways buzzed with laughter and hurried footsteps as students rushed to their classrooms, but for Ava Carter, the start of the day was filled with a quiet dread. The 11-year-old clutched her backpack straps tightly, her heart pounding against her chest. She had learned to love school once, but lately the thought of stepping into Mrs. Langley's classroom made her stomach twist into knots. Mrs. Langley was not like the other teachers. She never called on Ava during discussions. She never acknowledged her work, no matter how hard she tried. And when she did speak to her, it was with a cold, sneering tone that made her feel small, like she didn't belong. As Ava took her seat near the middle of the classroom, she focused on steadying her breath. She had done everything right today. Her homework was neatly written, her uniform was pressed, and she had even spent an extra hour memorizing her vocabulary words just in case. Mrs. Langley strolled in, her sharp heels clicking against the tiled floor. She was a woman in her late 50s, her graying blonde hair twisted into a tight bun. With thin, pursed lips and icy blue eyes, she exuded authority, an authority she used to crush those she deemed unworthy of her attention. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice laced with artificial sweetness. "I hope you all did your reading assignments. Let's begin with a little test." A collective groan filled the room, but Ava didn't mind. She had prepared. This was her chance to prove herself. Mrs. Langley's eyes scanned the room, and then, almost as if she was savoring the moment, her gaze landed on Ava. A slow, deliberate smirk curled at the corner of her lips. "You?" she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger. "Ava, stand up." Ava's hands trembled as she pushed her chair back and rose to her feet. Her classmates turned to look at her, some with pity, others with anticipation. "Let's see if you actually read the material," Mrs. Langley continued. She walked over, leaning in close, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with venom. "Though I wouldn't expect much. People like you, well, you're not exactly known for excelling in academics, are you?" A hush fell over the class. The words weren't loud, but they were sharp, slicing through Ava like a knife. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to ignore the heat rising in her cheeks. I did read it, Mum," she said, willing her voice to stay steady. Mrs. Langley smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "Oh? Then why don't you read this passage aloud for the class?" She tapped the heavy textbook on her desk. Ava swallowed hard and took a step forward. She had no choice. With trembling hands, she opened the book and found the passage Mrs. Langley had pointed to. The words blurred slightly as she blinked back the tears threatening to spill. Taking a deep breath, she began reading. At first, her voice was soft, but she pushed through. She knew the words. She had practiced them. But just as she reached the second sentence, Mrs. Langley let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Speak properly, child. It's English, not whatever broken dialect you people use at home." The room fell deathly silent. Ava felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. A sharp laugh broke through the stillness. It came from the back, from a boy named Jason, one of Mrs. Langley's favorites. Ava's chest tightened as shame burned in her stomach. Mrs. Langley folded her arms. "Sit down, Ava. Honestly, if you can't even read at a proper level, maybe you should consider classes more suited to your abilities." The words crushed her. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor, and never be seen again. Slowly, she sank back into her chair, her hands curled into fists beneath the desk. She could feel her classmates' eyes on her. Some looked down awkwardly, pretending not to notice. Others smirked, entertained by the humiliation. Ava's vision blurred, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not now. But what none of them knew, what even Mrs. Langley had no idea about, was that Ava's father was on his way, and when he walked through that door, everything would change. Ava sat frozen in her chair, her breath shallow, her hands trembling beneath the desk. The shame burned hot in her chest, suffocating. Mrs. Langley had already moved on, her attention shifting to another student as if humiliating Ava had been nothing more than a morning routine. But Ava couldn't move. She stared blankly at the open textbook in front of her, the words now meaningless. She wanted to be anywhere but here. At the front of the class, Mrs. Langley continued her lesson, her voice sharp and commanding. "And this is why articulation is important," she said, her gaze flicking back toward Ava with a smirk. "Some students simply lack the proper upbringing to speak fluently, which, unfortunately, puts them at a disadvantage." The words felt like another slap. Ava squeezed her eyes shut. She could hear Jason snickering behind her, hear the hushed whispers of her classmates. Then, a firm knock at the door. The sound was sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. Mrs. Langley paused mid-sentence, her expression twisting with mild annoyance. The door opened, and Ava's father walked in. A tall, commanding figure in a dark navy suit, Judge Malcolm Carter strode into the room with a presence that sucked the air from the space. He was the very definition of power, shoulders squared, jaw set, his dark brown eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. Ava's heart leapt in her chest. She hadn't known he was coming, but here he was. The class went completely silent. Even Jason, who had been grinning moments before, suddenly looked like he wanted to sink into his chair. Mrs. Langley blinked, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected visitor. But it was only for a second before she straightened, smoothing her blouse and plastering on a fake smile. "Ah, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone polite, but laced with that same condescension she always used with Ava. "I assume you're here to discuss something with administration. This is my class, and I was in the middle of a very important lesson." Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, exuding an authority that didn't need to be announced. He turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on Ava. She looked so small in her chair, her shoulders hunched forward, her face downcast. His jaw tightened. He knew that look. That was the look of a child who had been broken. He exhaled slowly, shifting his focus back to Mrs. Langley. "Actually," he said, his voice smooth but laced with steel, "I'm exactly where I need to be." Mrs. Langley faltered, but she quickly regained herself, offering a tight smile. "I'm afraid parents can't just barge into classrooms unannounced. If you'd like, I can schedule a meeting with the principal, but at the moment—" "No need," Malcolm cut in, his voice calm but leaving no room for argument. "I heard everything." The colour drained from Mrs. Langley's face. The room was so silent that the ticking of the classroom clock sounded deafening. Ava's classmates exchanged glances, the weight of what was happening finally sinking in. "I was standing right outside the door," Malcolm continued, taking a slow step forward, "and I heard every word you said to my daughter." Ava's breath hitched. Mrs. Langley's smile wavered, but she kept her voice level. "Sir, I assure you, you must have misunderstood. I was simply providing constructive criticism. Some students need a little extra help to—" Malcolm's eyes darkened. "Do not lie to me." The weight of his words sent an icy chill through the room. Mrs. Langley's mouth snapped shut. Malcolm took another step forward, his broad frame towering over her. "You didn't just embarrass my daughter," he said, his voice measured, controlled, but filled with a simmering rage. "You humiliated her. You insulted her intelligence. You disrespected her. And worst of all?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You thought no one was watching." Mrs. Langley opened her mouth, but no words came out. The air in the room had changed. This was not the father of a struggling student coming in to beg for fairness. This was Judge Malcolm Carter, a man who had spent his entire career upholding justice, tearing apart those who thought they could abuse their power without consequence. And right now, Mrs. Langley was looking into the eyes of a man who was about to dismantle her. "I assume you know who I am," Malcolm continued, his eyes never leaving hers. A flicker of recognition flashed across Mrs. Langley's face. Of course she knew. Judge Carter wasn't just any parent. He was one of the most respected judges in the state, a man known for handling some of the most high-profile civil rights cases in the country. He had been featured in news segments, spoken at national conferences, and now he was standing in her classroom, looking at her as if she were no better than the criminals he sentenced in court. A bead of sweat formed at her temple. She stammered, but Malcolm cut her off. "I will be speaking with the principal, the school board, and the district about what happened here today," he said, his voice cool and precise. "Not just about this incident, but about you. About the pattern of mistreatment and racial bias that I strongly suspect extends far beyond my daughter." Mrs. Langley's eyes widened in alarm. "Now wait just a moment." "I suggest you start updating your resume," Malcolm said coldly, "because after today, you won't be teaching here much longer." The class let out a collective gasp. Jason, who had been smirking earlier, now looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Mrs. Langley's face turned ghostly pale. You can't just—" "I can," Malcolm said simply, "and I will." The door suddenly swung open again. The principal, Mr. Reynolds, stood there, his face tight with concern. "Judge Carter," he said quickly, "I was just informed you were here. Can we step outside to discuss this?" Malcolm gave Mrs. Langley one last look, a promise of what was to come burning in his eyes, before turning toward the principal. Without another word, he strode out of the classroom, leaving behind an entire room of stunned silence. Ava sat there, barely breathing. For the first time that day, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. And as Mrs. Langley stood frozen, shaken to her core, Ava allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Justice was coming. The heavy classroom door clicked shut behind Judge Malcolm Carter, but the tension in the room remained suffocating. Ava sat perfectly still, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The once smirking Mrs. Langley stood at the front of the class, her face drained of color. For the first time, she wasn't the one in control. The power that she had wielded so carelessly over her students, especially Ava, had crumbled in an instant. The class, usually filled with the noise of idle chatter, was dead silent. No one laughed, no one whispered, not even Jason, who had made a habit of joining in on Mrs. Langley's subtle humiliations, could meet Ava's gaze. Ava had spent so long feeling like the smallest person in the room. But now she sat a little taller. Mrs. Langley cleared her throat, her usual confident posture noticeably shaken. "All right," she said stiffly, forcing a thin-lipped smile. "Everyone, let's get back to the lesson, shall we?" But the students didn't move. They weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at Ava. For the first time, Ava wasn't invisible. She wasn't the girl who was talked over, dismissed, belittled. She was the girl whose father had just turned the entire school on its head. Mrs. Langley swallowed hard, gripping the edges of her desk. She turned toward the whiteboard, pretending to focus on the notes she had written earlier. But Ava could see it. The slight tremble in her hands, the rigidness in her shoulders. She was afraid. And she should be. Judge Carter stood in the principal's office, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Across from him, Principal Reynolds shuffled uneasily behind his desk, adjusting his glasses as he tried to find the right words. "Judge Carter," Reynolds started, his voice cautious. I understand your frustration, but I want to assure you that Mrs. Langley is an experienced teacher." Malcolm let out a slow, measured breath. He had spent years sitting in courtrooms, dismantling the excuses of men who abused their power. He had heard every attempt to justify discrimination, every feeble defense of prejudice. He wasn't about to listen to another. "Mr. Reynolds," he interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "I didn't come here to hear excuses. I came to make sure this school understands exactly what kind of educator you've allowed to thrive here." The principal swallowed hard. I understand, but—" "No, I don't think you do," Malcolm continued, stepping closer. His presence filled the room, his quiet intensity enough to make Reynolds shift uncomfortably in his chair. "You see, this isn't just about today. This isn't about one incident. This is about a pattern." Reynolds blinked. "A pattern?" Malcolm nodded, placing his hands on the desk and leaning in slightly. "Do you think my daughter never told me about the way she was treated? How her work was ignored? How she was always overlooked in class discussions? Do you think I wasn't paying attention?" Reynolds paled, but Malcolm didn't stop. "You may not realize it, Principal Reynolds, but I am very familiar with cases of discrimination in education. I have ruled on them. I have won them. And if you think for a second that I won't take action against this school for fostering an environment where my daughter is belittled and targeted, then you have grossly underestimated me." The room fell silent. Reynolds looked down, shuffling the papers on his desk, as if hoping to find a way out of the moment. "Judge Carter," he finally said, his voice much weaker than before. What exactly are you asking for?" Malcolm's eyes darkened. "Immediate disciplinary action against Mrs. Langley, a formal investigation into her treatment of students, especially students of color, and a public commitment from this school to ensuring a fair, unbiased learning environment." Reynolds opened his mouth, but Malcolm wasn't finished. "If you fail to do this, I will escalate this beyond your office," he said coolly. "I have colleagues in education law, in civil rights litigation, and I promise you, this school does not want that kind of attention." Reynolds's face was now visibly sweating. He knew exactly who Malcolm Carter was. The idea of being at the center of a legal battle led by a sitting judge was the last thing he wanted. I understand," Reynolds murmured, nodding quickly. "I'll call for an emergency meeting with the school board. We will review the situation immediately." Malcolm leaned back, studying him. Then after a moment he nodded. "Good," he said. "Because I meant what I said, Mr. Reynolds. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every child who has ever been made to feel less than in that classroom. And if you allow it to continue, then trust me, you'll be seeing me again." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the principal sitting there, speechless, rattled, and fully aware that this was a fight he had already lost. The lesson had gone on, but the energy in the room was different. Ava wasn't sure what was happening outside, but she knew that her father was making things right. Her father never lost. Mrs. Langley had spent the past 20 minutes avoiding looking in Ava's direction, but Ava could see the tension in her every movement. The woman who had once spoken to her with such casual cruelty was now walking on eggshells, her voice tighter, her hands clenched at her sides. For the first time, she knew what it felt like to be powerless. Ava wasn't sure what would happen next. She didn't know if Mrs. Langley would be fired, or suspended, or simply forced to change. But she did know one thing. She wasn't afraid anymore. As she sat there, her spine straight, her head held high, she thought of what her father always told her. "You are powerful, Ava. Never let anyone make you forget that." And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Ava sat at the dinner table that night, pushing her peas around her plate, her mind swirling with everything that had happened. She could still see Mrs. Langley's face, how her once smug expression had crumbled the moment her father walked through the door. Her father sat across from her, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled up. His presence was always strong, but tonight, he looked tired. Not exhausted. No, Malcolm Carter was never weak, but worn. Fighting battles, even when you were destined to win them, had a cost. "Did they call?" Ava asked softly. not looking up from her plate. Malcolm sighed and set down his fork. He studied his daughter for a moment before answering. Yes. Principal Reynolds and the school board had an emergency meeting this afternoon. Ava's fingers tensed around her fork. And her father took a slow sip of water, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Langley has been placed on indefinite suspension while they conduct a full investigation into her conduct. I also made sure they would be looking into other student complaints, because I guarantee you're not the first child she's mistreated. Ava felt her heart pound in her chest. It wasn't the definitive punishment she had hoped for, but it was something. She'll be gone for now, Malcolm continued, leaning forward, his hands clasped together on the table. And when they finish their review, I have no doubt she'll never step foot in a classroom again. Ava exhaled, the weight of it all pressing against her ribs. It was happening. Justice was happening. But even still, something gnawed at her. She's going to say she didn't mean it, Ava muttered, stirring the mashed potatoes on her plate with her fork. That she was just being strict. That she wasn't being racist. Malcolm's sharp gaze softened as he looked at his daughter. You're right. She will. Ava swallowed hard, her voice smaller now. What if they believe her? Her father was quiet for a moment before reaching across the table, gently taking her hand in his. His palm was warm, steady, the same hands that had held her when she was a baby, the same hands that had lifted her onto his shoulders so she could see fireworks on the 4th of July, the same hands that had pointed at her from the audience every time she stepped on stage for a school recital, silently reminding her, I see you. I believe in you. I'm here. Ava, he said softly, truth has weight. And sometimes it takes time for people to feel it. But when it does, it's undeniable. She looked up at him, eyes filled with questions she didn't know how to ask. I have spent my life fighting battles just like this, Malcolm continued, his voice firm but gentle. And the one thing I know for certain is this. People like Mrs. Langley, they don't win in the end. They might get away with it for a while. They might make you feel small. But eventually, the truth catches up to them. Because people like us. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. We don't stay silent. And that is what real power looks like. Ava let his words settle over her like a warm blanket. She nodded slowly, finally finding the strength to believe him. By the time Ava returned to school the next morning, everything had changed. The tension in the air was unmistakable. Students whispered in the hallways. Teachers who had once turned a blind eye to Mrs. Langley's cruelty now spoke in hushed tones, as if realizing too late that they had ignored something that could no longer be ignored. Ava walked into the classroom, heart hammering. The first thing she noticed. Mrs. Langley's desk was empty. A new substitute teacher stood at the front of the room, adjusting the stack of lesson plans. But Ava barely heard the morning announcements, barely noticed the shuffle of students taking their seats, because something else had changed too. The way they looked at her. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't the girl everyone dismissed, the girl whose voice went unheard. Her classmates had seen what happened. They had witnessed it all, the cruelty, the humiliation, the injustice. And now, they knew what it looked like when justice fought back. Even Jason, the boy who had laughed at her humiliation just yesterday, wouldn't meet her gaze. His smirk was gone, his shoulders hunched slightly as he scribbled in his notebook, suddenly very interested in not being noticed. And Ava? She felt different. She was different. Because for the first time she wasn't afraid to take up space. She wasn't afraid to be seen. And when the substitute teacher called on her for an answer, Ava lifted her chin, straightened her back, and spoke. Loud, clear, unapologetically, and the class listened. It only took a week for the news to spread. The investigation confirmed what everyone already knew. Mrs. Langley had a long history of singling out students of color, belittling them, dismissing their efforts, and making them feel like they didn't belong. But this time, she had picked the wrong child. Because this time, that child had a father who wasn't afraid to tear apart the walls that protected her. By the time the final verdict came down, Mrs. Langley had been permanently removed from the school. Her teaching license was revoked. She would never work in education again. And Ava? She thrived. She aced her exams. She joined a debate club. She found her voice, and she used it. Because she had learned something more valuable than any lesson in the classroom. She had learned what true strength looked like. And it wasn't about fighting battles alone. It was about knowing when to stand up, and knowing who will stand beside you. Ava sat in the front row of an auditorium, her hands gripping the edges of her seat. Her father stood on the stage, microphone in hand, speaking to an audience of educators, parents and students at a civil rights and education summit. He told her story. And this time, the whole world was listening. And as he finished his speech, as he turned to face her with that same reassuring look he had given her all her life, Ava knew one thing for certain. She would never be silenced again.